Hi, GDC, and welcome to Launch Day, the emotional cost of releasing a game. I'm really honoured to be here. Thank you so much for letting me come speak about this topic I feel really passionate about at the Indie Summit. I'm Lucy Morris. I'm the studio and creative director of Starcult, which is a small indie studio based out of Wellington, New Zealand. And I'm really looking forward today to exploring some of these, quite secretive topics around the launch periods that we go through. Just to be clear, I'm not going to be talking to you about how to release your indie game. There's an almost infinite amount of resources out there, and ThinkFeast is on the best ways to go about this. And anything that I say at this point, I feel is probably just replication of those things. But what we don't see a lot of analysis of is the emotional and non-technical side of things running up to release and the struggles that come directly after launch, especially for smaller teams. After my studio released our first title last year and the dust had settled a bit, I thought about this a lot, and I wrote a Medium article as kind of a cathartic activity. So I wanted to get these complex and difficult emotions about this period out, and also to see if I was alone in these struggles as we navigate this honestly really difficult environment that we launch titles into at the moment. And turns out I wasn't alone, and the article seemed to resonate with quite a few people. So this is a talk on things that we went through, experiences that we had, and how to prepare yourself and your team emotionally to release an indie game. What I strongly believe is that there's a gap in our knowledge that instructs us how to navigate launches in a way that's sustainable to us and sustainable to our teams, and ways to protect ourselves from some of the more unforgiving parts of this gauntlet that all of us are running through. Therefore, this is a talk to prepare yourself for that time, especially from the perspective of a team from a country that's often left off of maps and popular media, and a talk to jumpstart discussions on the sometimes unrealistic expectations that we set for ourselves, and as well as those that others set for us in our launch windows. So in August 2020, we released our first title, Best Friend Forever, on PC and Nintendo Switch. I won't go too much into the game itself in this talk, but for brevity's sake, it's a dating sim crossed with a dog care simulator. You pet the dogs and you pet the owners. To give some context for the tips on this talk and the findings that we found, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our timeline and the challenges we encountered, and also the emotional reality of launching a game during COVID. I acknowledge full-heartedly that in New Zealand we've been really lucky in terms of our government's response to the pandemic, but I think it would also be remiss not to talk about the emotional cost of launching a game in the current climate and ignore the elephant in the room. The pandemic is something that has affected and is affecting everyone, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. And this also has an impact on the non-technical aspects of our release cycles. It's affecting us emotionally and physically. And in addition, if anyone listening to this has even worked on a game or released a game during the pandemic, congratulations, because it has not been easy, and I am very proud of you. So this was our planned timeline. The studio started up in 2019 at the start of the year. We spent a month setting up the studio and hiring, bouncing around ideas for what the project would be. And on February 2019, we started full production. Generally, I was aiming for pretty tight production timelines of smaller projects in which we could spend about a year to a year and a half producing something that would then in turn give us more runway in terms of diversifying our game portfolio and, future-proofing the future of the studio. So we planned for an announce around August, and moving into pre-production slightly after August, with the intention to release in 2020 on Valentine's Day, which would be very fitting for a dating sim. Unfortunately, our actual timeline ended up something like this, and I feel like this timeline might be quite relatable to anyone that's been navigating release cycles recently. So this is how we headed into 2020. We were battle weary and we were utterly exhausted from all the storms that were weathered. As you can see, you know, at the start it was pretty predictable and it was cohesive to our timeline. In August, we announced the project via Nintendo Direct at Gamescom. And then in 2020, we encountered like a few normal roadblocks that a first game studio would encounter. And I think that pushed our first release date back a little bit. But at the start of 2020, also COVID started up. So we announced a delay in February that we wouldn't be able to release on Valentine's Day. We pushed it back to May 14th. In April, New Zealand went into strict lockdown for 5 or 6 weeks, where we weren't allowed to leave the house except for our state-mandated half-an-hour exercise or to go to the doctor or the supermarket. And this was 2 weeks after we received a new programmer from Australia. We had to pack down our new office that we just moved into, move back home, and this was a really difficult period for us, as I'm sure lots of people listening to this can relate to, having to maintain the same sort of production output, but have your working life and personal life completely upended while you've got these, you know, international pressures going on. So May comes around and we have to delay again. Things are getting blown out. The world is reeling from what's going on. Timelines are impossible to predict. And the one good thing about this period was that our community was largely really supportive of these delays. At least consumers largely seem to understand the struggles that everybody is going through in terms of COVID right now. But this was demoralizing. We managed to head out of production around late May and headed into post-production. And then in August 27th, we managed to release. And I still can't quite believe this happened because it's so hard to release a game during this, like, in the middle of this climate. I am so proud of my team. And like, sometimes I still think about how amazing and impressive it was to be able to get this game out with all these challenges going on in the background. It shows immense mental and emotional fortitude to achieve something like this. And then we moved into live ops afterwards, which was quite an intense period, the immediate post-launch maintenance period. And I feel like this is really when the emotional cost of development was at its highest. It was a really intense and difficult time. And around November, the intense live ops kind of ended, and then it just went onwards indefinitely in terms of supporting the game. Like, technically, the game is still not complete because we are always updating it, we're always adding patches, we're always adding extra content. So it's not really, is it ever really done, I guess is the question. So heading into release window in August, we were already tired. We were at the usual end of project fatigue where the last 10% takes 90% of the work. And this was also our first title, so we poured a lot in trying to make the game make our mark, as a lot of indies do with their first title. We were demoralized from announcing delays and pushing back our release 3 times. It was, you know, an understandable disappointment from our community. It was a disappointment to us because we just really wanted to share what we had been working on. And outwardly, it seems like delays can mean a reprieve in terms of work, but as developers, you understand that a delay just means a longer time until the payoff of release. It means a longer time working on the same project and a longer time before you see the revenue generation from the game, which is, you know, a studio owner is an extra stressor. We were already demoralized from these delays, and we really wanted to share what we thought was like a utopian story that the world needed at that point. We were already stressed, mostly because there were so many unknowns surrounding release, and this was true before COVID. But especially during the pandemic, these stresses were exacerbated in terms of, whether it would be received well, what the reviews would say, what issues might be cropping up that need triaging and patching, but also because we had encountered so many roadblocks coming up to this point, it almost felt like, when is the other shoe going to drop? Not knowing how external partners were going to manage their own processes amidst their own COVID situations, which is super difficult to navigate. Not being able to estimate timelines when dates are like the holy grail in the game's press cycle. Not being able to perform at the same level of quality and finesse as releases pre-COVID. You're expected to still meet that bar, despite the fact that the world stage is completely different right now. But we were excited because we'd been working on this for a year and a half. We were passionate about it. We loved the project. And we had seen people love playing it at shows. We had a community that had started to build around it that was very supportive and very kind. And we just wanted to contribute this positive story to a world that was currently turned upside down. And we were glad it was out, but it wasn't done. We pushed the button and it released, but it's never done once you do that. I'm definitely not saying anything in this talk, just to be clear, that this is gospel or anything. But personally, my experience of this immediate post-launch time period was the most difficult part of the whole production cycle. Even bug squashing and like other roadblocks that we encountered wasn't as draining as this was. Launch is your one chance at the moment to legitimize the purpose of your entire production cycle, a year and a half of work, the investment of a significant period of time to create one thing, to prove your concept fully in terms of realization and reception, and likely your biggest chance to make your mark with this artifact. And as in recent past, we can see the zeitgeist coming back around, and sometimes that does happen. It's super rare, and the botched launch is something that never fails to make headlines in games. It's all in all at once, and launch has an immense amount of pressure tied to it because of this. So pain point one, I feel the emotional cost of launching games encompasses several pain points. The first of which being the end point of production is becoming extremely ephemeral. Some of the emotional drain from these launch windows definitely seems to stem from the amount of unpredictability that comes with pressing the release button. The immediate period after launch can be busy keeping up with press, communicating with the community. These are all incredibly time-consuming and sometimes exhausting activities that come at the end of an already full development cycle. But even aside from that, it seems like we're almost going towards games a continual service, not the sense that games are a service and free to play, but the amount of work that is involved post-launch to stay competitive in this market compared to even, say, 5 years ago is growing considerably. So I did a very scientific survey on Twitter. I asked a few questions to developers who had released at least one commercial title. And these are some topics that I've been thinking about since release, and even now, almost a year later, still releasing patches, still releasing content, still releasing seasonal content to eke out some exposure in sales. And although this isn't quite the traditional sense of games as a service as I mentioned, the endpoint of games is moving further and further and further out. We are a continual service if we want a fighting chance these days, and we are providing continual support, and in a lot of cases, updates and content if we want to be seen. And this has a cost, like not in terms of this is more work that I have to do, but you never really get closure on things at the moment. If you want to buff your long tail, or if you are, super interested in maximizing the worth of your game over time. So the first question, did you patch your title within 24 hours of releasing? This includes making a patch build, submitting it to a platform review queue, or making a patch build and pushing it to users live. 75 people surveyed 76% said yes. So this already shows that there is a very like on-call nature in terms of games, that there is a very immediate expectation that issues are supposed to be fixed very quickly. And that, I feel, is another pressure that we have to acknowledge here. How many patches did you push within 7 days of release? 54 people responded and 85% said 1 to 3. And I acknowledge this question is very broad because we don't know the length and breadth of those patches. We don't know how big they are or what amount of development time went into it. But I still think that this shows that there is a significant amount of work immediately post-release that it comes from just a place of almost unrealistic expectations of our time and like our ability to respond to things quickly. If you want to be featured in a holiday sale, you need to update your game with holiday-themed content. If you want to capitalize on momentum after release, like here, you need to keep a watchful eye on issues that crop up, issues in Steam reviews, and plan into production where feasible to mitigate these sorts of things happening after release. You want to fix them. You want to add content. And if you want to keep your community happy, you need to be almost on call, watching the social media channels, keeping an eye on emails, vetting content creators, doing interviews, responding to reviews that present issues, say on Steam. And so production and launch are really only the tip of the iceberg in terms of production cycles. And it plunges us straight into this games as a continual service cycle that feels like a hangover after the already intense period of development. Have you built or pushed a patch outside of your normal working hours for your title, after hours or overtime? 57 respondents with 75% saying yes. I feel like this is also concerning because it is showing that we have that on-call nature after release. We are so worried about how negative things like bugs or less than stellar experiences, which I'm sure no developer wants their consumers to have and is more than happy to fix. The pressure from having to fix these because of the impact of things, of like, say, negative Steam reviews, is becoming more and more of a pressure, and we're having to respond to it quicker and quicker. We're expected to be continually responsive in launch windows, turn things around at an almost inhuman pace because that launch window is so critical. And then to a lesser extent around the windows of visibility and the events to follow, say like summer sales. It's now expected to launch patches immediately, if not within a day of finding an issue. Launch bugs, as we've all seen in the press, can make or break a title. And losing that edge to negative reviews, no matter how quickly or easily the bug is fixed, can impact your title's entire lifespan. And that combined leads to this huge nebulous on-call pressure that we have to respond immediately. We have to be constantly vigilant, that we have to be just hugely emotionally invested. And I think this is definitely something that we should talk about a bit more. Pain point 2, post-launch on top of pre-production is painful. It's not just about releasing a game. While you're knee-deep in this pool of lava that is post-launch, you also have to have the brain space to be directing pre-production on the next thing. And this will depend on how you run your studio, but as I mentioned at the start of the talk, I really wanted to have tight production cycles. I wanted to have a good foundation to move forward into the next project as quickly as possible. So I had to have the brain space to be creative and look towards the next thing. The presence of mind to learn from my mistakes from this launch and be objective, while also, knee deep in this lava. I have to be able to support and guide my team towards our next shot to sustain the studio, while looking at, this miasma and wondering if I caused them or if it was my fault or something I could have done better for my team, something I could have guided us to avoid. And that period post-launch, especially for people directing, is incredibly confronting. If things go wrong, we we feel bad. We feel sometimes guilty or ashamed, or, you know, if only I had worked harder, I could have caught this. If only I had done X, Y, Z, then, you know, this process might have been easier. And I definitely felt a lot of that after the game came out. But at the same time, I want this difficult feedback. It's just on top of having to be intensely creative, overlapping with pre-prod. That is intensely difficult. That's the dichotomy that I experienced after launch. It's hard and it's exhausting, and it's the most difficult thing I've had to do is to be objective and be a buffer for the team, while also trying to tap into a very exhausted creative part of me to move forward into the next project. And I think it can't be understated that often we're creating emotional work at a large emotional cost to ourselves, which may not be immediately apparent, but definitely has become more apparent to me going forward. The release playing field is now less level than it ever was, and I feel like this is the biggest hurt that I continue to feel in terms of release, but the one I feel is also most unlikely to change because this is mostly out of our reach. You are expected to perform at the same level of finesse, of quality as anyone did pre-COVID. You were judged on the same playing field as you ever were, and the reality is that playing field is not level. In terms of team size, you are judged in the same way, regardless of world stresses. It's been very, very difficult to reconcile the fact that we're being judged the same, having struggled through a release in a pandemic than before, regardless of team resources, regardless of where your staff is located and what your time zone is. For instance, launch windows are very North American time zone centric, and we often found ourselves being up at 4 a.m. to action things, which, you know, is exhausting, and it's another physical and emotional commitment to make to this process. Regardless of connections, like who you know, what publisher you found, depending on where you're located in the world as well. Like there could be very few or quite a lot of options open to you. And regardless of experimentation, in terms of production, I've often noticed that experimentation and subverting of genre is very welcome. When you release, that is very much not the case. And when expectations are subverted and money is involved, the reception is quite different. So I just found the entire playing field quite uneven in many ways, and it's very easy to sit here and say, hey, that's unfair. We're all in the same boat, and we should recognize that and know that we are all in that same boat. We are all working to sometimes, like this standard up here that we might not all be able to reach because of anything on this list, and we will be judged the same. And I think this will tie into a point I'm going to make in a second, which is be kind to yourself and be realistic. Pain point 4, launch was about making wrongs right. And that is good, but it eclipsed enjoying what rights were right for us. If you're a community manager, or if you're like the head of a studio or planning biz dev, you'll have to kind of just wade into everything negative about the game when it launches, because you have to, because you need to react to it and you need to action those things. When positive or negative reviews dictate so much of our worth and future viability on storefronts, you need to digest these narratives and engage with them. And that is super important. But I think it's also important to acknowledge it's overwhelming and draining. This is something that you've worked on for a long time. It is natural to feel like this process is difficult. And that's not to say don't fix bugs. Definitely do fix bugs, but do it sustainably. We wanted this feedback. We only wanted our consumers to have the best experience. And yeah, like anything touched with sweaty human hands, it came out with flaws and imperfections. We released 8 patches in 77 days with 40 to 50 fixes as a team of just 4. And we responded to bug reports via email, Twitter, Facebook, Discord, Steam forums. We monitored email channels and we itemized quality of life feedback so we could give our consumers like an actionable plan going forward. And we wanted to give them the best experience, the experience we wanted them to have. And at the end of this highly charged marathon, we were just like heaving for breath at this point. And it is hard. Like, you want to enjoy this imperfect, sweaty creation. But instead of like sitting there and just looking at it, you've immediately got to be going, right, what's wrong? Let's fix this issue. Let's make everybody happier, because you want to. Have you felt pressured to create a patch outside of normal working hours, after hours, or overtime because of negative reviews, complaints, or social media pressure? 50 respondents, 70% said yes. I feel like this is also something that we should be talking about. This is people saying that they feel the need to work on call because of the negative impact that, you know, these expectations are having on us and on our games. We obviously need to create a more sustainable system where we can work on these things healthily and not create such unrealistic expectations for ourselves. Do you currently have any negative reviews on your product on any platform for issues that have since been patched? 46 respondents, 76% say yes. This is also important. We have all of this pressure on us, and even despite our best efforts, it can still result in things that negatively affect our long tails that might not always be super accurate. And I'm not often one to talk about Apple, but having reviews that are only reflected in terms of the latest patch or the latest update might be a way to get around this. I don't know. I'm not here to like create new game platforms or anything, but there are definitely issues in this ecosystem that we should probably discuss. What will we change for round 2 that we could have changed? A lot of this is kind of out of our hands, but change 1, we would have sort of facilitated better peer feedback in pre-prod or early production, specifically peer feedback. We had tons of consumer feedback, but that imbalance really worked against us when we launched, and we saw that there were some, you know, issues with design and systems that I feel like only an experienced peer probably could have caught beforehand. So I came up with this amazing Venn diagram, very artistic. This is what you need in pre-prod to early prod, which is the holy grail of feedback. You want it to be feedback you can action, feedback that's realistic for your team's resources, your production timeline, and, you know, if you're at a point in production, the things that might be suggested that are difficult to implement, because that's simply the nature of game development. You can't do everything. Feedback you can trust from peers that have experience, that know what they're talking about, that can save you from walking off any cliffs accidentally that they might have done in the past, and avoid you replicating like easily avoidable mistakes. And feedback that's constructive. Very important. We don't just want people to tell us, hey, your game sucks. The ultimate sweet spot is things that you can actually implement from sources that you can trust and that you can rely on, and that are constructive in a way that actually allows you to action and implement those things. But getting this good peer feedback is hindered by our weaknesses in not giving good feedback. It is not easy to give good feedback, and this is something we really need to work on. Not being able to receive feedback objectively, not wanting to hurt feelings, few established channels to get that grail feedback, and the fact that good feedback takes time and effort, which a lot of us are lacking. And it was cathartic and relieving to hear compliments about our game, but we honestly needed more critical grail feedback to save this pain down the line. I had relief to help outside our time zone working hours and launch window. Again, we were in GMT plus 12. Everything went out in PST time zones. We were working at 4 a.m. It was crappy. Manage expectations and be kind to ourselves, realizing that playing field isn't even. Taking time to appreciate the successes that we've had and the things we've managed to achieve is really important. Block out time for that in your team to do this and be mindful of what you've accomplished. Have a better post-prod plan for both mechanical and non-mechanical needs. This involved, things like self-care, protecting the team, hiring that comms person to be a buffer between the negative feedback and translating it when the team might be feeling raw, I think is really important. And keep talking about this and not forgetting the value you bring with a launch. Platforms are lucky to have you, and we should be talking about these things to hold them accountable. So a summary, seek support and counsel from others who have been through the process. Be kind, be realistic, make sure that you realize where you stand in terms of trying to achieve these very, very high expectations. What kind of state the world is in at the moment. Plan forward for extra support, blind spots, buffers, and time zone issues. We definitely would hire a community manager or a comms manager to go through all of this feedback and all of these channels after launch and really help us, not just in terms of being awake when we're not, but also being able to be a little bit of a buffer when you're in this launch period and feelings might be raw and tensions might be high, because it was definitely a difficult time for us. Work constructive peer feedback into your production cycle from an early stage. So accessing peer knowledge, not being afraid to expose designs and receive critical feedback, even though you might be protective and very loving of your systems. This is definitely something we're actioning going forward into our next project, and we definitely, I specifically have to be less precious about receiving feedback, because in the end, I want feedback that I can trust, that's actionable, and that is going to give the game the best shot in this really difficult environment we're launching into. That is super helpful, and peers don't want you to be replicating their mistakes. So that was a lot. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to contact me, you can email me here, and best of luck with your launches.